Race, religion, and ethnicity have become wedge issues in this election campaign. Here to talk about the politics driving the issues and what that says about the strength of our cultural mosaic, we welcome, in the nation's capital, Shima Khan, monthly columnist with the Globe and Mail. And with us here in studio, Aruna Pap, co-author of Unworthy Creature, a Punjabi daughter's memoir of honor, shame, and love. Avi Go, clinic director of the Metro Toronto Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic. Father Raymond D'Souza, chaplain for Newman House at Queen's University, editor-in-chief of Convivium magazine. Supriya Dwivedi, consultant, Crestview Strategy. And Michael Dentan, national political columnist for Post Media News. And we are delighted to welcome the cast of Ben-Hur to our program here today. It's great to have you all along. Shima, great to see you in our nation's capital as well. Let's start by just playing a clip here. This is Kelly Leitch, who is the Minister of Labour, Minister for the Status of Women, Conservative candidate in the riding of Simcoe Grey. And here's what she recently had to say about the topic du jour. Roll it, please.
Friends, the Conservative government is not afraid to defend Canadian values and to be clear that these practices have no place in Canadian society. By contrast, Justin Trudeau and Thomas Mulcair are more worried about political correctness than tackling these difficult issues that impact women. Justin Trudeau is concerned that calling these crimes barbaric would insult or offend those who defend and practice them. And the NDP voted against the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Practices Act because they didn't want to criminalize forced marriage or polygamy for grounds of being inadmissible to Canada.
Shima Khan, who we are seems to have become a big issue in this election campaign. And I just want to start by asking, how come?
Well, it's a great way to divide the electorate, pit the electorate against each other for the purposes of getting votes. I just see it as a purely cynical strategy. It was tried during the last Quebec provincial election by the PQ when it introduced the Charter of Values. So these issues seem to have come up during the election, which I think should make all of us a bit skeptical.
Aruna Pap, a cynical strategy to get votes. That's Shima's view. What's yours?
And I think everybody is playing to the voters and using women as their, ball. One person's throwing it from one court to the other. Who is going to serve the issues of women better and get at the heartstrings? And I think that is unfair.
Avi, what do you say?
Well, I totally agree, and I think it's really a shame that issues like the so-called barbaric cultural practice or the niqab issue is being made into a wedge issues, as if we can let our earth be burned by fossil fuel or now Aboriginal sisters be continue to killed or go missing, but by God, we should not allow those women to cover their face in the citizenship ceremony. And there are so many issues that we can talk about, even for citizenship. There are so many changes that have happened, including changes to language requirement, residency requirement. All of those changes actually have a negative impact on women than on men. Yet we're not talking about those real issues. We're talking about whether or not women can wear what they want to wear at citizenship ceremony, which is really.
Father Raymond D'Souza, what do you say?
I think actually part of the reason for these more identity-related issues to come to the surface is because on other subjects that normally divide political parties, economic policy, fiscal policy, tax policy, trade policy, there's not a great deal of difference between the parties. So it could be that there's a vacuum and these issues are sort of filling that vacuum. I mean, look, in an election campaign, there's lots of room to attribute ill motives to everybody around. But I do think that sort of homogeneity on economic issues, there's not much difference. Then how do you distinguish yourself? And I think that's the one reason why maybe these identity issues are coming a little bit more to the forefront.
Let me go to Supriya right beside you. Why is it that who we are has become such a big issue in this campaign?
Because it plays to voters, and I think Shima hit the nail on the head right off the bat, is that you've seen, we thought originally that this would just shore up a lot of support in Quebec, but there seems to be support all across the board in all provinces, Canadians of all stripes, and the Conservatives are using this to their advantage. One thing I would point out, though, is that even though it is, does have cross-country support, in terms of priority, it actually ranks quite low on prioritization. It's like 24 out of 25th. That's generally what we're seeing. So whether or not this will work come election day remains to be seen.
Michael, you write for a pretty conservative newspaper, the National Post, and yet I read what you wrote the other day about this issue, and you were pretty tough on this. How come?
I think that from a classical liberal point of view, or from a libertarian point of view, or even from a small c conservative point of view, you look at this issue and you think about human liberty, and to me anyway, it shakes out in the sense of what does it matter to the group if an individual decides that she wants to wear a niqab at her citizenship ceremony? Whose business is it if she chooses to do that or not? It's not the business of the state to interfere in that kind of a choice, and the Conservatives themselves used to have that position. In fact, Jason Kenney last year, when Pauline Marois in Quebec was playing the same sort of game, spoke up and said, oh, you know, it's not the government's business to tell people how to dress. Well, Jason Kenney was right back then.
You mentioned Jason Kenney, and he actually made those comments about 5 feet behind me when we did a one-on-one with him about 5 years ago. Here's what that looked like. Roll the clip, please. Could you have gone further and said, it's not consistent with Canadian values to have women walking the streets of Mississauga in burqas?
You know, I get there's a debate about that. My own personal view is the sort of British liberal view that the government shouldn't be telling people what they do and don't wear.
Father Raymond, what happened to that view held by Jason Kenney back then that apparently the government ought not to be telling people what to or what not to wear?
Well, you'd have to ask him. I mean, he's capable of answering for himself. My sense, and I would say that, I mean, we're right in Canada during election campaign to be concerned about the tone or the quality of our election campaign. That's obviously sensible. But on these identity issues, I think in Canada we can be a little proud, I mean, not in an immodest, you know, vainglorious way, but many countries around the world, including the United States, Western European countries, in their elections recently have had identity issues come to the fore in in a way that we would find quite shocking. And in fact, sometimes we preen a bit that we don't have that here. But we've managed, I think, to have, you know, multi-generational, large-scale immigration without provoking these kinds of backlashes. That's a Canadian accomplishment. Everywhere around the Western world, the questions of who are we, as immigration changes that demographically, what does it mean for our common life together, are coming in. And I'm not saying that we should just sort of say, in Canada, we don't pay attention to this because we're doing better than other places. But I do think it's worth noting that some of the sort of the sensitivity we have here is, it speaks well of us because we're not anywhere close to how these debates are playing out in the United Kingdom, in Holland, and in the United States, and shows that we have a sensitivity on that I think is laudable.
Well, some people are questioning how sensitive that sensitivity is nowadays. And Shima Khan, let me go to you on this one with the follow-up. The Conservative Party is obviously framing this as a women's rights issue, and they are suggesting that women are being forced to wear these niqabs during these potential ceremonies, and they're standing up for women's rights. How does that sound to you?
Laughable. This government standing up for the rights of women, if you see what the Conservative government has done to status of women in Canada, how it's ignored the pleas, the cries to have an inquiry into murdered and missing Aboriginal women. The Canadian Council of Muslim Women has done a study on the niqab in Canada about women who wear it, and the overwhelming number choose to wear it. Zunaira Ishaq, the woman who is at the center of this controversy, has herself made it clear that she chooses to wear it. So the government has put its fingers in its ears and doesn't want to hear whether a woman chooses to wear it or not. They're shouting over her, they're ignoring her. How is that standing up for women's rights?
Having said that, Michael, I was at an event yesterday. I spoke to let's leave the candidate's name out of this. Let's just say a GTA area candidate for the New Democrats, whom people know. And I said, what's going on with your polling lately? And the candidate said, damn niqab in Quebec. This is out there. Why is it out there so big?
Look, this has always been a hot button issue, primarily in Quebec, where I think something like 95% in the polls have shown that they agree with the Conservative government's position that there shouldn't be a niqab worn during a citizenship ceremony. and to an extent everywhere in the country. And so when you have a governing party that is crafting policy and crafting debates based on scientific polling, they're really trying to get ahead of where they think the people are. In other words, they're not leading, they're following what they think is public opinion. And the danger with that is that public opinion is not always informed and is not always right. That sounds like a terribly anti-democratic thing to say. But the fact is that on this issue, the initial instinct that somebody might have of, I don't like the niqab, I don't like the burqa, I don't like these things, that instinct may not be an informed instinct. And if you play to that, if the government plays to that, what it can lead to is I think anyway, a tacit permission for those sentiments to rise to the fore. And I think that's the big risk.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think it really speaks to the rise of the Islamophobia in Canada today. I mean, since 9/11, I think that we have seen a lot of the sort of public sentiment, but also fueled by government policy. Same thing happened around the anti-terrorism law that was introduced, both by previously the Liberal government and the Bill C-51 by the current government. It really feeds on the fear of Islam. I think many Canadians, unfortunately, have that sense. And I think that rather than like true leadership would be to tackle that issue and try to make Canadians embrace the various religions and the right to freedom in our country, as opposed to trying to use it as a wedge issue in order to win an election.
Well, for more on this story, we are happy to bring to people's attention this book called Unworthy Creature, which Aruna Pat, you co-authored with Barbara Kay, another National Post alumna on this program. Here's what the book looks like. And we've actually gone beyond the niqab issue in the last little while in this election campaign. We now have in this country a barbaric cultural practices hotline, where if, I gather, people see things that are described as barbaric cultural practices, they can call the hotline and presumably somebody's going to do something about it. Aruna, let's just start by understanding what that means. In your understanding, what's a barbaric cultural practice?
It was in 2010. I was in Vancouver, and Jason Kenney happened to be sitting at my table, unfortunately for him. And I had just witnessed a 9-year-old girl whose genital had been cut and she was infected, and I was traumatized by what I had seen. I had also not been able to help several girls who were forced into marriage and taken out of Canada. And one of those girls, I put her in my car and drove her all the way to Ottawa to Rona Ambrose's office and said, you look after her. So I was very, very angry and very frustrated. Rona Ambrose was the minister for the status of women at that time. And after I went up one side and down another, Jason Kenney, he says, Aruna, what can I do? What needs to be done? And I didn't realize what I was saying at that time. And I said, Canada needs a law that says culturally barbaric practices will not be tolerated in Canada.
So we have that now.
I said that. And 3 years later, there was an act that had the words, and I was pleasantly shocked. And
Pleasantly shocked or pleasantly surprised?
Pleasantly surprised and shocked, and said, somebody is listening.
Okay, so tell me this. Listening. We now have this hotline. Are you in favor of that?
I am absolutely in favor in that. And one of the reasons, yes, people don't like the word barbaric, they don't like the culture, but for 35 years, we've been hiding these practices under the carpet because we don't want to hurt the sensitivities of the cultural communities. And yet we have Canadian girls who are suffering, young people who are suffering, and nobody's looking after them.
Let me get some feedback from Shima on this.
About them.
Okay, Shima Khan,
sure,
you're hearing about this?
Yeah, so female genital mutilation, we had a huge debate about this, I think, in the 1990s, and across the board, Canadians were horrified, disgusted, and it was criminalized, specifically so. So we already have laws in the books to deal with this very specific subject, and there was a huge emotional debate about this, and there was universal condemnation. The name, if the goal is to help girls, I think we're all for that. There's no doubt about it. We'd like to approach the communities, and I can tell you across the board, these so-called cultural communities, which you're referring to, don't like the name, and if anything, are reticent to cooperate with a government that just seems to come at them with a sledgehammer. Condemning so-called cultural barbaric practices. I mean, you know, it's a loaded term. It's a racist term, and it does no good. You can have the same legislation to really affect and to deal with the problems that I think all Canadians agree should be dealt with in the most you know, forceful manner, but to do so with a sledgehammer that alienates the very groups that you're trying to assist is counterproductive.
And what's your view on the creation of this new hotline?
Well, again, there is 911. And I was reading, I forget where, but for example, there was an RCMP tip line set up, I guess, to report, quote, terrorist activities. 92% of the calls were deemed, you know, bunk. This was in the Ottawa Citizen just a few days ago. So it'll be interesting to see the statistics about this new hotline, this tip line. The assumption is that, you know, Canadians are going to report on people who are, let's face it, visible minorities, whose practices are deemed, you know, strange and whatnot. I think I can think of many cultural barbaric practices right here in Canada that have not been imported. Am I supposed to report those?
Father Raymond, let's talk about a column you did in the National Post the other day. It was actually, you kind of took aim at the Mayor of Calgary when he used this expression, dog whistle politics. Do you want to first of all explain what he meant by dog whistle politics and then explain to us why you took aim at him so forcefully?
Well, dog whistle politics, it's a word from campaign consultants. It means that you say one thing, but you're using a dog whistle, which means that at higher frequencies, the dogs can hear, but the regular people can't. So the question is when you use that term, who are the dogs that are supposedly hearing this? And the way that Mayor Nenshi he was talking about the refugee issue, which was my objection. And he said, well, when the government speaks about security issues and so forth, it's dog whistle politics, meaning that to ordinary people, it's a security thing, but to the dogs who are listening, it appeals to their bigotries. They don't like Arabs, they don't like Muslims, something like that.
So presumably the conservative base were the dogs in this case.
Well, he didn't actually, yeah, I suppose. He didn't specify, so I don't want to say that he specifies.
What didn't you like about the way he put it?
What I didn't like about that is because, you know, actually I think, you know, Aruna's point about 35 years and immigrant communities in Canada have matured. They're different now than they were 40 years ago. Why I was a little, I think, took the mayor's comments a little bit to heart, he was talking about his parents. His parents are Ismaili Muslims. They came from Tanzania in 1971. And he said, you know, if we'd been in Uganda on the other side of Lake Victoria, they could have been expelled in 1972, which is where part of my family came. My parents were already here, but my grandmother came and my uncle. But, you know, the Ismaili community, if you said, let's take 15,000 of them and put them in Canada, they've been exemplary community in Canada for 45 years. No one really has a problem with that. If you ask the Ismaili community about the current refugee system in Syria, they, being Muslims, not being anti-Arab, not being anti-Muslims, would say there are some concerns we would have about radicalization. So my point, who the dogs were, is that the actual people who are concerned about this are not the caricature of sort of, you know, rural, narrow-minded people who don't like people who are different. But within Canada's immigrant communities, of which the mayor and I are sort of the same generation, roughly same story, there's a diversity of views on this because part of our communities came to Canada because of the values and freedoms and norms we find here in juxtaposition to what was in the countries that were left behind. So I think that's my objection to his use of that.
Do you think the Conservative Party, let's call it in this case, is using dog whistle politics in the way that has been described?
I mean, I guess in that I consider dog whistle to mean you're trying to appeal to your base, and in this case, you know, they want to make sure that they get their base up off the couch on October 19th and into polling stations. I don't think that's something that anybody should be surprised at. It's the same thing when the NDP talks about, you know, childcare, or when the Liberals talk about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to get their base riled up and remember why they in fact vote Liberal or NDP or Conservative. Every party does it.
Okay, but I guess the difference is the NDP is not taking a position against the TPP. It's not based in racism.
Sure.
The Liberal Party is not, you know, beating the drum for the Charter because it's based in racism.
Of course.
But the suggestion here is that the Conservative Party is playing the race card, playing an anti-Muslim card.
Can I speak to that?
Okay, Shima, come on in, and then Supriya, if you want to follow up.
I'll just interject. You know, the Syrian refugee crisis The Conservatives have made it clear they want to give first priority to, quote, vulnerable minorities, unquote. When you go deeper, it means non-Muslims. And they've made it very clear. They've listed the groups that they want to prioritize, and Sunni Muslims are not part of that group. People who are actually fleeing ISIS for their lives, happen to be Muslim, are not part of that group. So quote, vulnerable minorities from Syria, that's a code word. For me, that's a dog whistle. And it's disgusting.
And I think...
Okay, Supriya, then Avi.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, of course not. But anybody who was willing to call it the Parti Québécois for their, appealing to their xenophobic base needs to come out and call out the Conservative Party for doing the exact same, because they're essentially using the exact same playbook here.
Avi.
Yeah, and I think, Father refers to the caricature, and I think that same thing is happening with this, the Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. Like, it's like create a caricature out of a community by maligning the entire community when supposedly the aim is to protect women. 50% of women in Canada are victims of violence of one sort or another. We just had, 3 killings outside of Ottawa a month ago in a small town, right? And nobody ever said that, well, there's something wrong with the culture in that small town. We recognize it as a violence against women issue. And if we want to address that issue, then we'll deal with it as a violence against women. But at the same time, this is not the first time I think politicians use protection of women to further other kind of sort of purpose. So for instance, for the longest time, we had laws in Canada that says Chinese Canadian cannot hire white women in their businesses because we need to protect the white women from the bad moral of Chinese, right? And so it's done in the name of protecting women, but of course we know the purpose is to stop these businesses from thriving.
All right, but
So
go ahead, Arun.
I think it's really misunderstood that cultural practices only happen, barbaric cultural practices only happen in immigrant communities, because right now, before the courts, the first forced marriage case is a blonde woman from Hamilton with blue eyes who was forced into it, and we've got 3 or 4 of them in court right now, and they're all Caucasian women who have been forced into marriages.
So this does not target the Muslim community?
It doesn't target anybody, So their culture, who were white women, whether they were from Bountiful, from wherever they are, their culture has barbaric practices. And it's not about just domestic violence. Violence against women is a global phenomenon, but the manifestation of that violence is rooted many times in cultural practices. Some have genital mutilation of females, others don't. Some had dowry deaths, others don't. Some had preferences for boy children and they kill their daughters, others don't. I have a long list of barbaric practices, but that does not mean that white people don't have culture. They do have
Supriya,
culture, but when we talk about culture,
Supriya, then Michael.
It's always immigrants.
We've got to share the time here, Supriya.
I mean,
Aruna, excuse me.
So I don't actually disagree with anything that you're saying here, but I think when we're talking about something and making it illegal, just because you have legislation with a catchy name doesn't make it extra illegal. It's already illegal. Female genital mutilation, as Shima pointed out, has already been on the books and has already been illegal. Forced marriage is already illegal. Polygamy is already illegal. Everything that is in this, Barbaric Cultural Practices Act is already been illegal for quite some time. So, the fact of the matter is, this is exactly appealing to a base and trying to get them off their couch and are trying to demonize whether or not, we can pinpoint those examples of those blonde women. But more often than not, we're talking about, the South Asian community or the Muslim community or the Middle Eastern community, North African community.
Michael, then Aruna.
I just would point out that I think I agree with you, and I think anybody presented with what you're talking about would be horrified. But the issue in this campaign is the conflation of this tip line with the niqab debate, with revocation of citizenship for convicted terrorists, with security concerns being raised in the context of a refugee crisis. Constantly, whenever the Prime Minister talks about this, he talks about the security issue, which is a real issue, but he stresses it. All of these things conflated. What is the effect of that? What is the impact? What is the message? It is a message that is targeted, I think, clearly at Muslims. Canadian Muslims?
We have been asking for a hotline since 1992. Talat Mahmoudin was the president of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women at that time. She and I went to the Minister for the Status of Women and said we need a hotline for women who are dealing with cultural practices.
Why is it being announced during the campaign?
Well,
why is it being announced now? Why was this not announced 6 months ago?
I don't know why it's
a
being
year
announced,
ago.
but what I am
Why
saying
now?
is, thank God somebody is listening, that we will have a hotline.
But
That's
speak
one
to his,
thing.
Speak to his issue, though, which is he is suspicious about the timing. What do you make of the timing of
Well,
that?
his view is that it is suspicious because of timing. My view is, thank God the government is listening. So we have different views on that. That's one thing. The other thing is that it is not just an issue of immigrants and ethnic minorities. It crosses national, ethnic, racial boundaries.
It'd be nice to hear the Conservative government actually say that, because I don't think they've said that once so far, nor have they, called for a calm in terms of the violence that we've seen spiking across Canada. A woman in a niqab in Toronto was attacked. A hijabi woman in Montreal
It doesn't
was
matter
attacked as well.
which kind of woman is attacked. Violence is never okay.
Okay,
Violence is
Supriya
never
says
okay.
it would be nice to hear from the Conservatives on that. We did actually last night. Rosemary Barton, the very fine host from Power and Politics on CBC News Network, I guess they call it now, got this out of Stephen Harper the other day. The vast, vast majority of Canadians understand our position on this and are behind it. The other parties have made a decision to make this an issue because they are frankly offside on public opinion, but that's their choice. Shima, let me go to you on this. The Prime Minister seems to be suggesting that it is the other parties that are making this a political issue, not him. What's your take on that?
Again, quite laughable, since they're the ones who have been raising it. And to be honest, I looked at those poll results. 93% of Quebecers rejected it, and 86% of Canadians not wanting the niqab at a citizenship ceremony. Well, when they're asked why, the majority say for identification purposes. And then the next highest category is because so the woman will follow the rules. It seems that the majority of the people who oppose it are misinformed as to exactly what's happening at these citizenship ceremonies. The government knows this, but they're ignoring that. That's number one. Mr. Harper raised the niqab issue again last night, saying he's thinking about banning it for civil servants. No one asked him, but he's raised it. And I mark my words now, as we get closer to the election, the Conservative Party will raise the issue about women voting while wearing the niqab. I guarantee you.
Father Raymond, where are you on that?
Well, my instinct is always to maximize religious liberty. So anything that's a restriction on religious liberties, of which the niqab would be in that category, I'm unsympathetic to. But I would say that the niqab or the burqa is a little different in that face covering, it does change a cultural ambiance. If we were around this table and we had someone with a face covered, it's a different kind of discussion. And so I think that in courts, in official acts of state, there's a room for an argument about it. Now, an election campaign, as was famously said once upon a time, was not a good time to discuss
Talk about
these things.
serious issues, yeah.
You're allowed, I think, to be suspicious of parties introducing things in election campaigns. That's, no one should be shocked that there's gambling taking place, as the Humphrey Bogart said. But I think on the niqab and on the burqa, there is a room for a discussion that's, let's say, different than, say, the Quebec Charter, which, banned, Jewish skull caps and crucifixes and really took a very sort of unnecessarily broad approach. So my instinct is always to favor greater religious liberty, but I think we can have a discussion about that. And I think that I would, given what we've been talking about here, that the portrayal of this as being sort of the majority culture, leave that aside for a moment, imposing a view on a minority culture is not correct, because within the Muslim community in Canada, there are different views about these things. On barbaric practices, on hotlines, on how the dynamics of the community operate, they exist. So it's not just the fact that, that the majority culture is trying to pick on a minority culture.
Sure, but
some of these voices are there.
Okay, Michael, then
The Prime
Supriya.
Minister in the clip we just saw was referring to popular opinion. He said, the people are behind us. You're talking about a minority rights issue using popular opinion as your argument. The reason for the Charter of Rights and the reason for Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights, which was the prelude to the Charter of Rights, was precisely to protect minorities in situations where public opinion, the majority public opinion, disagrees with the minority public opinion. So that's a very dangerous territory for the leader of the country to be taking, in my view.
That's actually exactly right. And Michael, took several words out of my mouth right there. But the one thing that I would add is that not too long ago, a plurality of Canadians would have been opposed to interracial marriage. Not too long ago, they would have been opposed to marriage equality. Not too long ago, they would have opposed having a Jewish person be sitting as prime minister. So the fact is, public opinion changes, and it is in fact often wrong. And the reason why we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms is to protect the minority against the majority. And whether that majority is within a subset of a community, like Father D'Souza was saying, in terms of many Muslims also being opposed to the niqab, or whether that is the larger majority of Canadians cross-sectionally, I don't think matters. That's precisely why we have a rule of law in this country, and that's why it makes it so great.
Aruna.
I was just going to say, what we hear from with you and everybody else is the national mainstream media, but there is also an ethnic media going on, and we've had several debates on ethnic media. We just had 27 seniors who come together to talk about cultural practices, and seniors are blamed for cultural practices, and there is a need for and a voice from the majority saying that we need to stop these. We need to have a dialogue so all of us don't look bad. There is a few people in the community who practice these bad cultural practices, and we end up fishing for women from the canal and all of that. It needs to, so the majority supports this.
I just want to understand that. So are you saying that the wearing of a niqab during a citizenship ceremony is so offensive as to not be protected by the Charter? I
was talking more about the culturally barbaric practices law, and the support from the immigrant community is there to say, and for me, and I witnesses, even if you don't like the title, it has now started a dialogue. We can talk about it. For 30 years, we've not been able to say what these practices were because we were going to hurt somebody's feeling.
I gotcha. Avi?
I guess it's the real concern that, the concern about making certain community look back because some people practice certain things, or is the real concern about protecting women, right? So if the concern is about protecting women, then we have already heard that all of the changes that are made have already been in law for a long time. But the concern is about making someone look bad or a community look bad. Then we have to question, why would it be that a small number of people in the community doing certain things will make the entire community look bad, right? So that goes to the issue about Canadian identity, right? So if a white person kill his wife, nobody's going to say all white men are barbaric. But if a handful of South Asian or,
mass shootings are actually a really great example that are, almost always perpetrated by white males.
Right.
And yet we're not.
We don't play the culture card in that case.
No.
Double standard?
Double standard, but I think it speaks to the fact that there is racism still exists in Canada. Unfortunately, we want to think of ourselves as a mosaic country. We have the Charter of Rights and Freedom, which is fundamental, but on a day-to-day basis, there's still a lot of people out there who don't embrace the Charter values. Even though at the same time, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom is seen as the one major thing that unite Canada. It's one Canadian value that is often cited by Canadians as reflecting who they are.
It is true. Every poll I've ever seen, it's off the charts popular. People really see themselves reflected in that charter and appreciate it.
Yet at the same time, we don't always practice that. So I think maybe we could use the barbaric culture or whatever as an opportunity to talk about the Canadian Charter of Rights and the values that are included in the Charter, the respect for minority, respect for equality, no matter who you are in terms of your race, ability, gender.
The freedom of religion.
Exactly, and the embrace of the multiculturalism, which is also part of the Charter as well.
Let me introduce two words into our discussion right here that came up in a debate, I guess it was this was the Globe and Mail debate in Calgary. Two words used by the Prime Minister of the country, and it provoked a response. Let's roll that, please.
Let's try and bring it back to the economy.
Yeah, well, let me just correct the record on a couple of things.
Refugees are about the economy, David.
Trudeau said about refugees. First of all, The fact of the matter is, we have not taken away health care from immigrants and refugees. On the contrary, the only time we've removed it is where we have clearly bogus refugee claimants who have been refused and turned down. We do not offer them a better health care plan than the ordinary Canadian can receive. I think that's something that most new and existing and old stock Canadians agree with.
Okay, did you hear the two words at the end there? Old stock. That's what we're going for here. I don't think he was talking about Stockwell Day either. I think it was something else. Can we keep the wide shot up here, Sheldon? And I don't know if you can get Shima on this picture as well. It might be, that might be too much. But who here among us identifies as an old stock Canadian?
I do.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to be a great-grandmother very soon. And I think I'm the old stock that has produced a lot of new stock. And they are really very good new stock Canadians. And you're not. You haven't been working as hard as I have been at producing new stock.
How many kids have you produced over the years? You're not keeping up your end.
No stock. So I think...
Can I ask you, though, where were you born?
I was born in India.
Can you be an old stock Canadian if you're born?
For 42 years, I've been here. I've lived majority of my life in Canada. I was 21 when I came here. So I am old stock. If anybody challenges that, they're going to be in trouble.
Okay.
Aruna, I've lived here for 50 years, and I don't consider myself old stock. I just consider myself
Well, that's your
Canadian.
opinion, but I am, and nobody's going to take that away from me.
Why divide us into old stock and new stock?
It was a terminology used to say something that, if he had to do it again, I'm sure he'll do it differently. But I laughed and I smiled and I said, there he goes talking about me, about being old in Canada and all that. And I didn't take it personally as if he's jabbing Indian, Canadians all over again and saying, you're not white enough. I didn't take it that way.
Michael, where were you born?
I was born in Canada, but my dad came over in '57 from Belgium, so I consider myself new stock.
You don't?
I think, if we're going to make those distinctions, I think of Canadian families who've been here for generations as, patrician upper Canadian families, or maybe somebody whose family settled the St. Lawrence, way back in the seigneurial system in those days.
Not enough to have been here for 4 decades then.
In some ways it's a useless construct. I think Harper was just trying to draw a distinction between new Canadians and Canadians who've been here a while. And he used an expression that in Quebec I think is quite common. It's certainly common in French, Purlaine de souche, and it's translated into English in Quebec media often as old stock, and it's referred to without any controversy in Quebec. And I think he probably thought he could use that in a different context and not get himself in trouble. And he was wrong in that assumption.
I'm trying to remember. You from Montreal?
Yeah, I am.
Are you old stock Canadian then?
I consider myself Canadian. I don't necessarily divide myself up into one camp or the other. And to be fair to our Prime Minister, I don't necessarily think he was being outrightly offensive or racist or xenophobic or what have you in that comment. But I think you've eroded a lot of goodwill when you enact policies and are playing a really dangerous thin line on this that I think had somebody else said it or had he said it 4 years ago, I don't think people would have reacted the same way that they are now.
Shima, your reaction, let me just get Shima on this because there have been 2 basic reactions to this. Number one was he just threw the expression out there. He didn't mean anything by it. It's just a statement of... Which was Mayor... Okay. Was it really? Yeah. That was Mayor Nenchi's position? Other people, Shima, have responded as you have, which is... It's an offensive expression. It's borderline racist. He ought not to use it. It's playing that card again. Tell me why you believe that.
Well, to be honest, I was listening to the debate and I didn't hear it, and it was only afterwards. I'm not as offended by what he said, but for me, it's just more of the same. It sort of fits a pattern of our Prime Minister playing, divisive politics. And his vision of Canada, dividing people into different groups. That's how I took it. That's how he sees our country, and that's how he's played our country. And so for me, it was just more of the same. I grew up in Quebec. I've heard Purlaine and de souche, and it was a dividing line. It was demarcation. You're either, francophone or you're not. You're either allophone or, an immigrant. It spoke more to the ethnic vote, the money and ethnic vote comment from Jacques Parizeau. So maybe we got used to it, and so when I heard it again, it was like, yeah, more of the same. But it just fits a pattern of, instead of uniting Canadians, into one sort of an inclusive, family and what we share in common, our Prime Minister rarely does that.
Avi.
I agree, and also we need to know the context in which the comment was made. He was talking about denying health care to refugees, which he and Jason Kenney has described as bogus refugees. So I think maybe he wasn't thinking about, sort of the race, white versus non-white, but certainly he was talking about, thinking about those who are deserving of our healthcare system and those who are not. And he's drawing a line between, the so-called bogus refugees or the newcomers versus the old stock Canadians. But I think there is a wider implication for that because again, there is racism in Canada. So even if the Prime Minister doesn't mean it that way, it can be heard in that way by some people, and reinforcing that view that some are real Canadians, but others are not. And I remember back in the 80s when Mayor of Markham, right, Carol Bell, was talking about the Chinese coming in, taking away whatever the backbones, like you're driving away the backbones of our communities. When she talked about the backbones, she didn't use the word white, but that's what she was referring to. And so we need to be very cognizant of this kind of terms in the context of where we are today in Canada.
I want to follow up. Oh, sorry, Father Raymond, go ahead.
On the substance of the issue, which was that, leave aside how fraudulent refugee claims are determined, but this is part of the maturity of the immigrant experience in the country, is that there are few communities that are more intolerant, to use that loaded term, of immigration fraud than immigrant communities. And so that's why I find that the implication of racism or anti-immigrant I think it's wrong, because in the immigrant communities that have come to the country and, made their new life here, those communities are probably more intolerant of immigration fraud, however it's determined, than you would
that makes sense.
Make them look bad?
But the point is that it's not, to say that it's racist because it's pitting white Canadians against the brown Canadians is just missing the point, because actually in the brown immigrant communities, there's a lot less sympathy for that than maybe in the
Because if you waited your turn to get in, you don't like somebody else queue jumping. Okay.
Isn't the irony here, though, that the Conservatives themselves have a track record of welcoming new Canadians, right? In fact, in an interview with the Wall Street Journal last year, Prime Minister Harper was asked about this, and he was asked to explain the reasons for the party's success in the 2011 election. And he said something along the lines of, we did it because we appealed and were able to draw new Canadians and immigrant communities into the party in a way that had never happened before. So the Conservative Party clearly understands the value of the electoral value of courting new Canadians, and for obvious reasons, because the GTA, of course, is full of ridings, including new ridings in this election that have heavy populations of immigrant communities. So they're aware of all this, and yet they're willing to play this card anyway. And that's what I find so unfortunate about the whole debate.
My point is not that it's the and yet. There's no and yet, because actually in the very communities you're talking about, the position on cracking down on immigration fraud is very popular.
There is an and yet if two cabinet ministers are sitting down and having a press conference and talking about a barbaric practices tip line in the middle of an election campaign, when they're also talking about refugees and they're also talking about the niqab debate. There is an and yet. This was done deliberately to push buttons, and it is working.
And the fact that the Conservatives made such inroads with new Canadian communities, specifically within the South Asian community, in the the 905 ridings, I think they've just flushed that down the toilet. And Patrick Brown did the same thing for the PCs here in Ontario, getting a lot of new Canadian support and bringing a lot of new people into the fold that wouldn't necessarily be engaged politically. And it would be really nice to see some of these people, like the Jason Kenneys, like the Patrick Browns, stand up and say, you know what, we're getting into dangerous territory here. The conversation and the rhetoric is now taking a negative turn, whether or not that's what we intended or not. But you need to speak out once people are getting hurt, and that's what we're seeing across the board right now.
Are you suggesting stand by one follow-up, are you suggesting that these communities are going to abandon the Conservatives on election day?
Absolutely not, because
Hang on, I want to hear what she has to say.
I mean, I am saying that come October 19th, I do not think the Conservatives are going to see the same level of support amongst the new Canadian communities that they have in the past. And we're already seeing that in the Greater Vancouver area, if you are to believe recent polling in that
Aruna.
In the last 2 weeks, I've attended about 5 gatherings of the South Asian community who are supportive of the community, and these issues were debated. They were standing room only. They are not abandoning the Prime Minister and the PC party. No, it's very hard to get into those debates, but people want the Prime Minister to hear that they are supporting them. And so it's wrong to say 905 immigrant communities are abandoning the Prime Minister and his stand and the issues that are being debated. It is absolutely wrong.
Well, we'll know for sure in less than a couple of weeks.
And we have another 3 more to go this week.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
Shima, go ahead.
I think Priya pointed to this about asking politicians to stand up. If there's one thing I'm proud about is the Quebec legislature last week, following the assault on a pregnant Muslim woman. The motion brought forward by Françoise David to condemn Islamophobia, and it was passed unanimously. That sends a very strong message to a population that the highest legislative body in the province is speaking with one voice. And it would be very nice, given this current climate, a dangerous climate, I might add, if we had legislatures across the rest of the country do the same. In Ontario, in Alberta, across the country. And that would be, just here, just yesterday, not far from where I am right now, a Muslim woman, her 19-year-old disabled daughter, was verbally attacked by a shopper, telling her to take off her effing towel or rag. The climate is getting very uncomfortable, and we need political leadership. We're not getting it from the Conservatives. We need to see it from more and more politicians.
No, and just to Shima's point there, during the Charter of Values debate in Quebec, Jacques Parizeau is very famously known for his money and the ethnic comment following the 1995 referendum. But he also came out and spoke out during that values debate to say, we're going too far. And this tone is going in a place that I don't recognize the party. And I've heard from a lot of people. And it would be really nice to see other Conservatives do the same.
I think this has been a great discussion, and that's our time. Shima, it's good of you to be there on the line from the nation's capital for us. Everybody here in our studio, thanks so much for contributing to this tonight. Less than 2 weeks to go.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.